A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for the RSIS ISAS seminar titled India's Many Transitions Through the Eyes of a Civil Servant. The seminar will shed light on our guest speaker, Dr. Subbarao's book titled Just a Mercenary, Notes from My Life and Career, subsequently talking about his career in the Indian administration while also discussing India's economic and political transition. This event has been jointly organized by the S. Rajaratnam School at NTU and the Institute of South Asia Studies here at NUS. And so without much ado, we are delighted to have with us as our guest speaker, Dr. Subbarao. Dr. Subbarao has served as the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and prior to that was the finance secretary to the Government of India and secretary to the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. After stepping down from his role at the Reserve Bank, Dr. Subbarao has been a visiting fellow at several universities, including NUS and NTU. So we are much delighted to have you here again. This session will be chaired by Dr. Pushpa Sharma, visiting senior research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. So I shall now invite Dr. Pushpa to begin the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Devyani. I think I'm the only one wearing a mask today. I don't mean to hide my face. I was feeling a bit uncomfortable. It might be something, it might be nothing, but rather than, it's better to take precautions. Well, I mean, as Devyani said, we are here for this seminar, India's Many Transitions Through the Eyes of a Civil Servant. When you talk about India's transitions, definitely India's independence until today, India has gone through several transitions, we can see, on the economic front, on the political front, on the social front, from a closed economy to an open one. Speak into the mic. Very, fast rising economy today, the fastest rising, of course, in the world, but also we are seeing jobless growth in today's India. That's what has the story been coming about. And there are also many different, social, political kinds of things that we have seen in India since independence. And Dr. Subbarao, who had spent 40 years working with India's government at the state level, at the central level in Delhi, and also at the helm of India's central bank, Reserve Bank of India, at a very difficult time, actually. 2008, that was the year the global financial crisis that started when he took charge of the Reserve Bank of India, and then he stepped down 2013. So perhaps we can hear a lot about the many transitions that India has gone through from Dr. Subbarao, who had spent his time on the ground, at the grassroots, on the front lines, working with the state government and also working at the center. And Dr. Subbarao has just published his second book, Just a Mercenary, Notes from My Life and Career. So many of the things that he will be talking about are also in this book. But of course, it's not, easy and possible to discuss the whole book in a 1-hour seminar. So he will talk about the transitions, particularly in the way that he has seen it. So we hope that this will be a very stimulating session. So Dr. Subbarao, perhaps you can have around 40 minutes for the first presentation, and then we can go for question and answer. Up to you.
Thank you, Devyani. Thank you, Pushpa. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be back here in ISAS. Let me start by telling you a story. I took over as governor of the Reserve Bank of India on the 5th of September 2008, over 15 years ago. 5th of September 2008 is a very significant date in the history of world finance. Not because I took over as governor, because of all the seismic events that happened in the 2 weeks following the 5th of September 2008. 5 September, I took over. 7th of September 2008, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two housing finance companies in the US, went bankrupt and they were taken over by the government. 9th of September, countrywide, a major bank fell down. 11th of September, Merrill Lynch, a global investment bank, vanished. 13th of September, AIG, one of the largest insurance companies in the world, came to the brink of a meltdown. 14th of September, Washington Mutual dissolved. 15th of September, the Big Bang, Lehman Brothers collapsed. With all these seismic events, storied institutions in America falling, culminating in the collapse of Lehman Brothers on the 15th of September 2008. It took a devastating toll on global growth and global economy, global finance. The global financial system came to a near-death experience. Global economy went into a downturn, the deepest, most severe downturn since the Great Depression 70 years ago. Governments, policymakers, central banks, regulators, they were all scared, worried, anxious. Financial markets went into a tizzy. They were gripped with fear and panic. And ordinary people all over the world were scared, concerned about their wealth and their money. Those seismic events, tumultuous events in American finance, ricocheted around the world. They had an impact on virtually every country. India too was affected. Our growth slumped, the rupee crashed, bond yields went down. All our financial markets, money markets, currency markets, stock markets, bond markets, debt markets, all of them went into a tizzy. So for me as a Greenhorn governor, it was a baptism by fire. The story going around in India was that we shouldn't have been affected by the crisis. Why should India be affected by the crisis? The crisis should affect America and Europe, where banks sinned, they indulged in excesses, they indulged in subprime assets, their regulators were sleeping, whereas in India, our banks were healthy, our regulators were keeping a vigil. Why should we be affected? So the story, the narrative that formed out of that was that we shouldn't have been affected by the crisis, but for the new governor who came and he brought on the crisis. So wherever I went, people would ask me, "Sir, when will the crisis be over?" As if I knew. Nobody on the planet had an answer to that question. But I used to play along because I couldn't defend myself. I said, if you people thought I brought on the crisis will end when my term will be over. And for good measure, I used to tell them when my term would be over. But here's the thing. The week after I left the Reserve Bank, the crisis ended. Okay. Growth started going up, inflation started coming down, the rupee stabilized, everything was hunky-dory. So it was a very difficult time. But why am I telling you that story? I'm telling you that story because it illustrates one of the biggest transitions India went through over the last 50 years, a transition from a closed economy to an open economy. The reason we were affected by the crisis was because we were globalized. We were integrated into the world by way of trade, by way of finance. Let me give you a bit of a context to that. 1947, India became independent. For the next 40, 45 years, we were one of the most closed economies in the world, in India. No foreign trade, no foreign investment, no foreign technology. We got to be self-sufficient. We got to make everything ourselves. That changed in 1991. To give you just a flavor of life before 1991, most of you were not born. I experienced that. Life before 1991 in India, if we went abroad, we got $20 of foreign exchange, just $20. If you wanted an LPG connection or a landline connection, you had to make a booking and wait for years, for it to come. There used to be something called a Padmini car or a Vespa scooter. People used to book that, and that booking receipt used to be given as a dowry because it lasted that long. If you went into a grocery store, you had a choice of 3 brands of soap and 2 brands of shampoo. And people used to import low-end cameras and low-end calculators at that time and smuggle them. That was life before 1991. And it changed gradually. But in 2008, we were affected by the crisis because we were integrated into the world. Just to give you an idea of how much we were integrated, the Asian financial crisis of 1998, starting with the Thai baht falling, and 2008, the global financial crisis, in that 10-year period, India had changed. We were not affected by the Asian financial crisis because we were not integrated so much into the world. But by 2008, in that 10-year period, India had integrated by way of trade, by way of finance. So that is easily, Yusuf, this, okay, yeah, sorry. Sorry, yeah. Yeah, that's easily one of the most significant transitions in India from a closed to an open economy. But why am I talking about transitions? Because as Pushpa said, I wrote this book about my civil service career and my 5 years at the RBI. The RSIS and ISAS said, this is not a book event. Don't talk about the book. But they said, oh, talk about the book. So here's my attempt at not talking about the book and talking about the book. I thought I will capture that in some transitions India underwent as I served in the government and in the central bank and traveled around the world over the last 50 years. The first transition I spoke about. Now let me move to the second transition. One of the most significant is a transition from gender disparity to gender parity. We've seen it all over the world. In every country, we've seen it in India too. 15 years ago, I was on a flight and it had not taken off. There was a pre-flight announcement by the captain, and the woman sitting next to me, she was a stranger. I didn't know her. She said to me, I want to get off the plane if I had a chance. I said, what happened? She said, the pilot is a woman. I don't trust her. It's a woman telling me about a woman pilot. As I was flying into Singapore last week, the pilot was a woman. I was completely nonchalant. Woman, man. That's how much gender sensitivity has changed over time. Aspirations, especially of girls in India, have changed. You go to any remote school, and far off from the main roads, ask girls, what do you want to be? They'd say, we want to be an astronaut like Kalpana Chawla. We want to be a corporate executive like Indira Nooyi. Those are aspirations for girls. Aspirations of girls have really gone up. But first, let me talk about the transition from gender disparity to gender parity in the civil services in which I served. When I joined the civil service in the early 1970s, women were just a trickle. There were just about 9% of women until the 1970s. When I joined, 15% of my batch were women. Today, about 22% are women. So there's been an improvement, but not full improvement, as you can see. It's not even 1/3. It's got to be at least a half. While recruitment into the civil services is improving, career management is not. There are still some jobs which are stereotyped for women, some jobs stereotyped for men. And many women are not given positions that are considered men bastions. One of the defining jobs, those of you who are familiar with the IAS in India know, one of the defining jobs of an IAS officer in India is being the collector of a district. In fact, there is no other job anywhere in the world which is equivalent to collector of a district in India. Up until 15 years ago, women were not even being posted as collectors. But 2 years ago, of the 14 districts in Kerala, 10 had women collectors. So it's changing, improving, but not fast enough. But let me tell you about the transition from disparity to parity in the larger world. Take school education, primary school. We know the challenges for school education are enrollment, retention, and achievement levels. We've largely cracked enrollment. 40 years ago, when I used to go to villages, children not going to school, but today, 100% enrollment. Retention, about 90%. Achievement levels, still very poor. One of the things I'm proud about India, many things I'm proud about, one of the things I'm proud about in India is this massive school lunch program that India started. The reason we've been able to improve enrollment to near 100% is because of this midday meal program. There's nothing like that. Giving a hot meal to hundreds and millions of children every workday afternoon is a phenomenal thing. That's the reason girls have come into school. Enrollment solved. Retention was the next challenge. Girls were dropping out after primary school. Why? It realized that one of the problems was that there were no toilets for girls. So 15 years ago, there was a big program to build toilets for girls, and girls' retention in schools improved. But achievement levels are still poor, both for boys and for girls. You know, when I used to go to villages in my early postings, one of the most familiar images I have is of this young girls who gathered there, skimpily clad, scruffy hair, ashen face, shallow cheeks, anemic looks, vacant eyes. That was the picture I had in mind. Today, you travel in India, you cross district roads, you will see girls well-clad, well-nourished, wearing a uniform, riding a cycle to school. That's the phenomenal change that's come about in gender parity. As they used to say, if poverty has a face, I think it's said by a Pakistani economist, Mahbub al-Haq, if poverty has a face, if poverty has a gender, it is female. And if poverty has a face, it is that of a girl child. But today, a happy girl child is the symbol of changing India. I was at Yale University last fall, and they had a program of getting girls into STEM, science, technology, engineering, management. I don't know if you have it in Singapore, but I think India should do that, getting girls into STEM disciplines. I want to tell you a story about my own gender sensitization. Now, when I was a middle-level officer in the Ministry of Finance, we had to submit a report to the Parliament the following morning, and I and my team worked several days. We got the minister's approval. He signed off at about 6 p.m., minister, and then we had to prepare the report. All of that took till about 9:30 p.m. And what was left at 9:30 p.m. was the pure legwork of binding copies and sending them off to Parliament, etc. So my work was done because I was somewhat at the top. That work of the legwork had to be handled by an undersecretary who was 3 levels below me. And she was a woman, about my age at that time. So I told her at 9:30, I told Rita, you know, this is getting quite late. So why don't you go home? We've done all the intellectual work. What's left is the legwork. I'll ask one of the guys to handle this because it'll go on till 2, 3 in the morning. I thought she'd be happy, you know, that this boss being so considerate to me. Her face became red. She was angry, flustered. And she said to me, her boss, as firmly as she could, "Sir, if you don't mind, I will stay and do my job." Okay? So that is the reverse gender sensitization. You know, that was very important. I learned that positive gender sensitization is as important as negative gender sensitization. My last story on gender disparities. How many of you heard of Ela Bhatt? She was a noted social worker in Ahmedabad. And she passed away a few years ago, but she spent a lifetime organizing textile workers of Ahmedabad, women textile workers of Ahmedabad, you know, getting them together, getting them livelihood support, etc. She wrote a book. It's called We Are Poor, But So Many. And one of the things she says in that book is she took a vegetable vendor to a bank for a loan. She and the vegetable vendor went to the bank. The bank manager interviewed the proposed borrower and interviewed Ela Bhatt as well, asked a lot of questions, asked for some documents, and said, "Will you come back next week with more documents?" So they went back next week, more questions, more documents, more interrogation. And he said, "Will you come back after 10 days?" So they went back after 10 days, more questions, more documents. "Can you come back after 2 days?" Then she realized, she says, that I found that financial illiteracy is on the other side of the table. So it's very important to be sensitive to these concerns. When I was here in ISAS, Iqbal, Mr. Gopinath Pillai done a study on girls and women across South Asia. But I think you should review that. And I think it's a very important thing to do, across South Asia, how gender disparity is dissolving. Right. Third thing, transition I want to talk about is this transition from a docile to a cooperative to contentious federalism. These are all disparate transitions, but they're all captured in my book, so I'm talking about them. India has 28 states and 9 union territories. And the Constitution defines the roles and responsibilities of states and the central government, what taxes they can collect, what expenditure they're responsible for. It's quite neatly done. What states should do, what center must do, what is concurrent to both center and states. But over time, historically, states have been complaining against the center. Our expenditures are much more than our taxes. You don't give us enough money. You've taken away all our taxation powers. You should, why do you need so much money? You must transfer more of it to us. Those are standard traditional grievances of states against the center. But over the last 10, 15 years, the grievances have been against some of the hidden things. Now, tax transfers from the center to state take place according to a formula that's quite transparent, done by a constitutionally appointed finance commission. But there are lots of transfers that take place from the center to state that are not very clear. Let me give you an example. Farmers' agitation. 2 years ago, farmers were agitating for writing off loans and for raising the MSP, minimum support price. Now, you must have noticed that agitation was largely confined to North Indian states. South Indian states did not participate in that. Why? Because if you increase the minimum support price, who benefits? Farmers with a marketable surplus. And where are the farmers with a marketable surplus? In the North Indian states. So that is a hidden transfer. If the government of India, if the central government raises the price, MSP, there is a hidden transfer. Similarly, if some foreign investment is coming, let's say Foxconn is coming to India and they say, we want to go to a particular state. And the central government says, no, you don't go there, you go to this state. That is also a biased attitude. Now, increasingly, these were all dormant. In fact, I know when I was serving, center-state tensions used to be there, but it used to be central government versus all the states, regardless of politics. Regardless which party the chief minister belonged to, the center versus the states. Today, it is center versus some states aligned to the center versus the rest of the states. So that polarization is taking place. That is not a healthy thing. We're not able to implement many of the second-generation reforms like labor, land, etc., because of these tensions between center and states. Center-state tensions are common across all federations. They're not unique to India. They're there in rich countries like the US, Canada, Australia. They're there in emerging economies like South Africa, Indonesia, India. In fact, East Timor separated from Indonesia because of some tension or anguish that their natural resources are being taken away from them. So East Timor separated. Even though EU was not a strict federation, but one of the reasons for Brexit is actually anger that Northern Europe is having to subsidize Southern Europe. So these tensions among federating units are common, but there needs to be mechanisms for resolving them. My concern is that in India, they're fast dissolving. One other thing that's going to add further fuel to the center-state tensions is the emerging north-south divide in India. Over the last 15 years, particularly over the last 10 years, southern states have been doing better in terms of any economic parameter, in terms of any social parameter, in terms of growth rate, per capita income, social economic indicators like health and education, investment climate, rule of law and order. South Indian states are doing better. They're getting onto a virtuous cycle. In a federation, these differences should not deepen. Why? Because if it is one country, people should move. That's what happens, right? People move to jobs or entrepreneurs come to where people are. So what should happen in India is that if there are jobs in the south, people should move. If there's opportunities for selling, entrepreneurs should move to the north. That's what should happen in a free economy. In fact, that is the secret behind American capitalism, labor mobility. American labor moved to where jobs were. That's why that's one of the ingredients of American growth. Bernanke used to say that America is losing mobility, labor mobility. You know why? Because the American dream that we have to have a house. So once people have a house, they got stuck to it. If you have a house in Texas, if the jobs in Illinois, Chicago, you won't go there. If the jobs in California, you won't go there. You want to live in Texas. So in India, for these tensions to dissolve, there should be migration, internal migration. There are barriers to internal migration because of culture, traditions, habits, etc. It's happening, but not happening deeply enough to bridge these north-south differences. Today, for every rupee that a state like Karnataka, a South Indian state like Karnataka, contributes to the central pool, Karnataka gets back 47 paise. For every rupee a poor state like Bihar contributes, Bihar gets back 1.67. So in some sense, South Indian states are cross-subsidizing North Indian states. That is par for the course. That happens in every federation. It must happen. India is one country. But the question that is emerging today is, are we hitting the limits of that cross-subsidization? One other thing that's going to come 2 years from now, 2026, is the delimitation of parliament seats. Today, an average South Indian has a greater representation in the parliament than an average North Indian, because the seat delimitation was frozen in 2001. It's up for reconfiguration in 2026. If that happens, South Indian states will lose some parliament seats and North Indian states will gain. So can you see what's going to happen? South Indian states will have to continue to cross-subsidize. At around the same time, they are losing political clout. It's a double whammy. So that is another transition that India will have to manage. We moved from a docile to cooperative federalism for some time, but the concern is whether we're transiting from a cooperative federalism to a contentious federalism. The fourth transition I want to talk about is transition from agriculture directly to services and back to manufacturing. Excuse me. We know from development experience that as countries grow rich, they grow from agriculture to industry, then to services. That's those stages of growth model. Historically, that's how countries developed, starting with the UK, England, Industrial Revolution, then they went to services. Singapore is a services society, but you can't manufacturing. India leapfrogged over manufacturing. So we went directly from agriculture to services. So our agriculture sector remained high, big, but our manufacturing sector did not grow. Then we went off to services. For a country of India's per capita income, our service sector is a much larger proportion of GDP. 15 years ago, we used to take pride in that India has defied the standard textbook model of going from agriculture to industry to services. We leapfrogged over that. We rewrote the textbooks. Now that's catching up with us now. We now realize that we need manufacturing. Why? Jobs. One of the biggest problems India has is unemployment. 10 million people join the labor force every year, perhaps more. We're not even able to create half as many jobs, with the result that the unemployment problem is becoming bigger and bigger every year. Where are jobs going to come from? Jobs are not going to come from the agriculture sector. If agriculture productivity improves as we want it to, agriculture will actually throw away 50 to 60 million people. Jobs are not going to come from the services sector. That this image outside India that India's services sector is booming is shaped by the software sector in Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune, Noida, etc. But that's a very small sliver. The software sector employs about 7 to 8 million people in a labor force of 1 billion people. So much of India's services sector is security guards and construction workers. We got to the services sector cannot provide jobs for hundreds of millions of people. Also, female labor force participation rate in India is not only low, but declining. If there's time, I'll talk about it. But if women join the labor force, the employment problem will become even larger, the unemployment problem. We've got to find jobs for these people, and jobs have to come from the manufacturing sector. So there's a debate going on in India today. There's one side which says that India should replicate the China model. After all, we've seen China over the last 25 years, manufacturing hub of the world. India should replicate that model. But people who contest that say that India cannot replicate the China model of manufacturing growth for export because the global value chain, which was the backbone of Chinese foray into manufacturing export, that is losing its comparative advantage because of robotics, machine learning, etc. Also, when China entered the world markets in the 1990s, demand for manufacturing was growing at a scorching pace. And when China entered in the 1990s, globalization was seen as a benign force. Good for the rich world, good for the emerging world. Today, all those things have turned around. The global value chain is losing its comparative advantage. Demand for manufacturing is softening. Why? Because people are getting older, populations in rich countries are aging. As rich countries age, they consume more services than manufacturers. So the demand for manufacturers is coming down, is softening. And most importantly, there's a backlash against globalization. So India cannot replicate the China model of success. My successor, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, and a co-author have written a book recently. Some of you might have read about it. Their main argument is this, that don't focus on manufacturing. That's gone. Focus on services, because that's going to be big. India has a first mover advantage. India has a software advantage. We have a skilled workforce. Train our people. We should get into services. It's possible, as COVID lockdown has showed, that it is possible to provide services from a distance. The government's argument, although they've not articulated it so clearly, as no government does really, which is that, no, we're getting this manufacturing into India. This is just the entry point. Once this comes in, the entire value chain will come in both the forward and backward linkages. Again, the other side says that that is an empty hope. India cannot attract the value chain because of our high tariffs. So forget about manufacturing. So this tension between whether we should focus on manufacturing or focus on services is one of the things that's going to define the next transition. My own feeling is that as much as Dr. Rajan's thesis is good, you must focus on services. That's the future. You can't get into services tomorrow. You've got to train our workforce. That's for 10 years. That's a 10-year plan. For the next 10 years, you have 100 million people who are unskilled or at best semi-skilled. You've got to find them jobs. About 30 to 40% of them women. So manufacturing is the option. And I'm not as pessimistic about manufacturing as many people are. India imports about 100 billion from China every year. Even if we can manufacture 50% of that, 50 billion in India, that's a big deal. And as Professor Arvind Panagaria says, that it is true that global trade is slowing. But even in a situation where global trade is slowing, it should be possible for India to increase its global footprint because our share is so small. It's about 3 to 4%. So what if it comes down from 100 to 98? You should still be able to go from 3 to 4%. So I believe that too much of manufacturing pessimism is unwarranted. We need manufacturing. That takes me to my final transition, which I'll spend about 5 to 7 minutes on, which is this transition from a Hindu rate of growth to becoming the fastest growing large economy in the world today. For the first 3 to 4 decades after independence, from 1950s until 1990s, the average growth in India was 3%. And Professor K. and Raj, one of the maverick economists in India, has said that this is the Hindu rate of growth. Hindus cannot aspire to grow faster than this. This is even as East Asia was growing, as China was growing, Hindus are condemned to 3% growth. You're fatalistic, stay happy with that. But today, we are the fastest growing large economy in the world. With GDP of 3.9 trillion in current dollars, we're the 5th largest economy behind the US, China, Germany, and Japan. There are other economies which are growing faster, but they're small. There are economies larger than India's, which are growing slower. So India's growth matters not only to India, but to the world. Because if a large economy is growing fast, it matters to the world. Okay. Admittedly, India growth story is shining. But I want to spend 3 minutes or 4 minutes on what is the good, the bad, and the ugly of the India growth story. The good is this, that over the last 10 years, there's been a remarkable transition. 10 years ago, growth was slowing, inflation was high, rupee was volatile, government's fiscal position was a cause for concern, big corporates were getting bankrupt, a bad loan problem had crippled corporate and bank balance sheets. We're dreading getting into a stagflation situation. 10 years on, it's a remarkable transition. Today, growth is strong, inflation is hitting the target, rupee is stable. We birthed at least 12 unicorns. The bad loan problem has been solved. Corporate balance sheet, bank balance sheets, they're very good. India is probably going to take off. If you go to India, the crane is the most ubiquitous sight on the urban landscape. They used to say that a crane is the national bird of China. Now it's the national bird of India. The digital revolution is generating jobs, improving productivity, generating revenue for the government. Extreme poverty has been all but eliminated. That's phenomenal in a country once considered synonymous with mass deprivation. We celebrated G20, turned into a festival of India last year, landed on the moon. So there's euphoria about optimism about India. That's the good part of it. What's the bad part of the India growth story? A lot of people say that the growth story is being exaggerated. Economists who dirtied their hands with numbers say that there are large discrepancies in data estimation. If you net out the discrepancies, the underlying growth momentum is much less impressive. And they also say that this is catch-up growth. Poor countries grow faster. Just like a child grows faster than an adult, poor countries grow faster. Can you maintain this momentum? In the last 35 years, since economic reforms, India has clocked growth of 7.6% 7 times. We could never ever sustain that for more than 2 consecutive years. Compare that with China, 9 to 10% growth on a trot for 30 years. So can we maintain this momentum? Especially because people say that the current growth is coming from a single engine, public investment. You can't sustain this growth unless you're firing on all the cylinders. So that's the bad part of the story. The ugly part of the India growth story, which in my view is a matter of great concern, is defined by 2 maladies: unemployment and inequalities. Prime Minister Modi, candidate Modi, back in 2014, when I took part in the NISA seminar in 2014 at that time, came into office promising that unemployment or creating employment will be his biggest priority. 10 years on, the unemployment rate is not budged at all. Ironically, in a country where millions struggle every day, this campaign, which is going to end shortly, jobs and prices were not there. The campaign was defined by other concerns. So unemployment is a big problem. As I told you, 100 million people have to be found jobs. One of the distressing things about India's unemployment is the declining female labor force participation rate. And people say it's because of, women have to take care of children. It's not new. Women have been taking care of children since time immemorial. It's not happened in the last 20 years. And if anything, India is less conservative than Bangladesh and Nepal. Bangladesh and Nepal have higher female labor force participation rates than India. So that's a cause for concern. The second thing is inequality. Thomas Piketty, phenomenal economist, much celebrated, they've done a study, the World Inequality Lab. They said that India is one of the most unequal societies in the world today, and inequality is much worse than during the British colonial times in 1922. Solving inequality, President Obama said inequality is a moral issue. It is a moral issue. You cannot have inequalities. But for India, it is much more than a moral issue. It is much more than a political issue. It is an economic issue. Unless you solve inequalities, you can't sustain growth. Why? Because benefits of growth have to go down to the bottom 300 to 400 million people. Only if they see their incomes going up will they spend, because the marginal propensity to consume is higher. If they consume, they'll spur production. They'll generate jobs, they'll generate growth, and we can get onto a virtuous cycle. But if, on the other hand, as is happening today, you're growing, but the benefits of growth are not going to the bottom segments, then you cannot sustain your growth. Just to give you one factoid, the economy is sizzling at 7 to 7.5%. Household consumption is 3%. That's a huge discrepancy. Overall economy growing at 7 to 7.5%, household consumption is 3%, which means that it is an illustration of inequality. So the good, the bad, and ugly of the India growth story. So those are the 5 transitions I spoke about. Thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you, Pushpa.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Subbarao. I think we had a very insightful 40 minutes of the various transitions that India has gone through, and I hope
One of the many transitions, some of the many
transitions. And I'm sure there are questions that will obviously come from the floor. But before I open the floor, I think something that you said during the final part is really very interesting, that India has been among the fastest growing among the largest economies, but still this growth is not enough. And despite the growth that India has, about 7.5%, there have not been many jobs because the growth have been in the services sector, or say the sectors which have not been able to create many jobs for the people at the bottom. And now, as we look at the impetus that India has been giving, perhaps even in manufacturing, it's the high-tech kind of manufacturing that India is focusing more on. And this also has got to do perhaps with the competition that India has with the other countries around the world in terms of achieving even higher growth. So as India goes, perhaps, I mean, if it goes for even higher growth, and this growth doesn't come from labor-intensive kind of manufacturing, as you just said, but from high-tech kind of manufacturing, what would be the scenario, at that time? That's one. And the other one is not related, but I was reading, some parts of in the book, and I think there was an article that has been republished over here that you wrote in 2022. That's also, I think, a transition that perhaps would be good to talk about where you say that the IAS, as it used to be earlier, has not been the same in India, and the face has been, not been of a permanent kind of a government, because the bureaucracy in India is supposed to be the permanent kind of government, but that has not been the case anymore, is what I think you have said. Now, when do you think this transition within the bureaucracy in the civil service has taken place? What could be the reasons, and what do you see the future of India in terms of the permanent government of India getting weakened? I would say that.
Should I answer that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Then we'll go.
Yeah. Thank you very much for those two very important questions. About jobless growth, that is certainly true. And one of the arguments is that India is actually focusing on high tech, whose job intensity is very low. On the other hand, we should be focusing on the MSME sector, which is job intensive. You're absolutely right. And there's no discussion of that at all in the election campaign. The BJP, two major parties, national parties, BJP just said we'll create so many jobs. That's a blanket statement, which they're taking off in 2014. And the Congress party said that we will train so many apprentices, but not really saying where the money is going to come from. And they said we will give an unemployment dole to all unemployed people. Where's the money going to come from for all this? And is that the solution to the employment problem? So the counter argument to that is, yes, we are getting high-tech manufacturing, but high-tech manufacturing has this, it'll promote the vertical chain, the value chain. MSMEs will come in the feeder to the high-tech manufacturing. That's where we will get jobs. To some extent, that argument is valid. What is distressing, though, is that if you look at the data, India is losing share in low manufacturers, in shoes, in toys, in clothes. So we should be focusing on that. As well, also on high-tech, but particularly on MSMEs and informal enterprises. That's where jobs are. We should be focusing on that. And unfortunately, that's not caught attention in the campaign. The second thing about the Indian Administrative Service, some of you might be familiar with the IAS, to which I belonged, and I was a proud member of the IAS. The British, when we were a colonial, under colonial rule, they had the Indian Civil Service. It was largely in the 19th century, it was open only to white Britons. They joined the Indian Civil Service and came to serve in India. But in the early 20th century, it opened up also to Indians. And the ICS, Indian Civil Service, had established a formidable reputation. But the ICS had very limited functions: collect taxes and maintain law and order. But when we became independent, and in the 1950s, the IAS was instituted as a homegrown response to the successor to the ICS, because this was a country embarking on an unprecedented experiment of introducing democracy in a society of low literacy, low awareness levels, unprecedented anywhere in the world. And the IAS was seen as a response to that. In the event, the IAS built a formidable reputation for building a development state from the greenhorns, as it were. And the early decades of the IAS, they earned a name for competence, commitment, integrity. But in the 70s, in the 80s, that started dissolving. Every IAS officer, you said, when did it start? And when? Every IAS officer believes that, it ended with him retiring, and the dirt started after that. You can't put a date or a timeline on this. This is a very gradual thing. So a service that is known for integrity, commitment, competence is today become not synonym, but today largely associated with ineptitude, incompetence, lack of integrity, lack of professional and pecuniary integrity. Lots of committees have gone into lots of studies. You touch anyone, they'll tell you about how to reform the IAS. Some people said, do away with it altogether. We don't need a generalist civil service anymore. We need specialists. But that's a big, big debate. What's wrong with the IAS also is too many things. You can write a book about it. You can have a big seminar on it. But in my view, the biggest thing that has come in the way of the IAS that has caused deterioration in the IAS is the perverse system of rewards and penalties. There is no reward for good performance. There is no penalty for bad performance. With the result that people who once joined, they continue. There are many, many things wrong with the IAS, but this, in my view, is one of the biggest things.
Thank you, Dr. Subbarao. Now we open the floor for questions. Perhaps we'll take 2 or 3 at a time, and then you'll respond, and we'll go for another round. So I've seen Dr. Runjo.
Thank you, Dr. Subbarao. Both enlightening as well as entertaining talk. So I had another follow-up question on the bureaucracy. You talked about the early days, and you also talked about the British, and when it was ICS was known as the steel frame of India. I think maybe till the 80s and 90s, you might correct me, the IAS and the civil services in general were mostly drawn from the middle classes, upper middle classes. But we've seen a widening of the pool of both applicants and successful candidates, which is for the good. And this has been sort of valorized in recent films like 12th Fail, which was about an IPS officer from a rural background, poor background. But that's a good thing. But at the same time, what we've seen in the last maybe 2-3 decades, and again, you might correct me on that, is that we see far more applicants from, say, in engineering or doctors even applying. So we don't, the earlier model of the so-called liberal arts bureaucrat, people with a wide knowledge of many things, that has now become far more sort of narrow and technocratic to my mind. Is that a good or a bad thing? Can you sort of comment on that?
Sure. Professor, you will take it. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Thank you very much for your very illuminating talk. My name is Punendra Jain, and I am a fellow here, visiting fellow at ISS from Australia, but Indian origin for sure. So I give you 3 scenarios. 4th of June. One is a BJP government with Mr. Modi as Prime Minister. Second scenario, BJP government without Mr. Modi as Prime Minister. Third, a non-BJP government. So and one of these scenarios will come true, of course, on 4th of June. How do you see India's economic policy changing in either of these 3 scenarios, which will be different from what has been happening or what has happened in recent years?
Thank you.
My name is Anuradha, and I'm a journalist with IFR Asia. Thanks, Doctor. I had two questions. One is, what is the reason for the female fall in the female participation in the workforce? And second is that India has so far benefited from good demographics, but many of the southern states are now showing low demographics. So is that going to be a concern at some time? An aging population combined with poverty? I mean, is that an issue?
Thank you. Maybe respond to you.
Yeah. Thank you for those questions. Ranajay, you asked me to comment about the catchment for the IAS. It is true that when I joined the civil service 50 years ago, about 20% of my batchmates were children of civil servants. Today, my children didn't want to join the civil service. Even today, you would think that only about 3 to 4% of the recruits would have parents from the civil service. That's going down. So there's a larger catchment in terms of where the parents have been, in terms of geography, in terms of rural-urban divide, etc. It's very good. You talked about education. More and more engineers and doctors are coming. For those of you who are not familiar, the requirement for an IAS is a degree, just a degree, any college, anywhere, just a degree. The rationale behind that is that you're not going to apply what you learned in college in terms of a specific subject, whether you studied physics or philosophy or chemistry or ceramics, it doesn't matter. What is important is the wide exposure that you get by going to college, by going to university. It is that broader knowledge that should inform your administrative capability. It is not exactly what you study. And having gone to an IIT myself, I take umbrage at your suggestion that IIT students are more narrow-minded. I'll give you a guarantee. You put a random IIT student or random liberal arts student, you will not be able to make out. If you put them to a Turing test, you wouldn't know who's come from which background. Yeah. But we can talk about it. Ranajay is my old friend, so I'm being a little more caustic with him. Yeah. Professor Jain, about three scenarios that you painted. Actually, one of the things that you notice about India is a very smooth transition. Ideologically, there are not much differences between one government and another. Now, you go back from the 1990s onwards, with which I'm familiar, we started on reforms, and every successive government carried on from where the earlier government left, although they've changed in terms of parties. When Vajpayee government came, then when the UPA government came, succeeding the Vajpayee government, and then when the NDA government under Prime Minister Modi had come, there's not been much changes. GST, for example, Prime Minister Modi would like to claim that the GST is his invention. It's not. GFC had been in train for 15 years. He'd like to claim that the bankruptcy code is his invention. No, it's not. Bankruptcy code has been in train for 15 years. If given a chance, he'd like to claim that the internet is his invention. Okay, that's not true. Okay, so that of course is entirely his doing. So, but to answer your question, I would not see any sharp departure in terms of economic policy. It is the liberal media which says BJP a right-wing party and Congress left of the center and all that. Living in India, having worked within the government, I don't see such sharp defining thing. Like in the UK, for example, we're seeing the campaign, the sharp distinction between the Labour and Conservative. We don't see that in India. Okay. Anuradha, your question about FLPR, my request to both to RSIS and ISAS is actually to have another seminar on female labor force participation rate. It's a very important thing. I've read some reports, I've participated in some conferences about female labor force participation rate. What is distressing is that FLPR is not only low, but it's declining. At worst, it should stay put, right? It's declining. What is the reason for it? People are given several explanations. One explanation, as I said earlier, women have to take care of children. Women have to take care of children all the time. If anything, the burden of childcare is shifting, gradually from shifting, men are also sharing that. And it's not something that started yesterday in the last 5 years. It's been there since times immemorial. And as I said, Bangladesh and Nepal have better FLPR than India, so that conservative norms do not explain this. The other explanation people give is that girls are studying longer. Earlier they used to finish at school, now they go to college. They're studying for 13, 14, 15 years. If that is true, indeed that is true, but that should be a one-time quantum jump. It should not be a continuous thing, right? Once girls have gone, they spend 4 more years, you're getting a continuous stream of college-educated girls. So that cannot explain this continuous decline. Actually, my explanation, which I find most persuasive, is actually a positive thing. My explanation for the falling FLPR is that prosperity has increased across India, across Indian villages. Compared to 10 years ago, people have seen an increase in their incomes. So this shift of balance between labor and leisure is changing. Women find it not worthwhile to work at the going wages, so they prefer to stay at home and do household work. If wages go up, they will certainly come back into the labor force. And the evidence for this is Northeast India. Northeast India, income levels have not gone up as much as in the rest of India. And you will find that FLPR there is still high. It's in the main rest of India that FLPR has come down because of prosperity. I see a positive thing behind this, but it is an issue that must be investigated. Thank you. What is the question, Anuradha, about demographics?
But now these states are having a very slow growing population.
Yeah.
That can shift certain states.
See, as a country, we've reached a fertility rate, below replacement level last year. It's unimaginable. Because 40 years ago, when I used to work in the villages and the frontiers, we used to think of population as a big problem, undoing all our development work. Today, the narrative has completely changed, that India has got a huge demographic dividend because our median age is 28 to 29, China is 38, America is 39. We have hundreds of millions of young people in the labor force who will work, who will save, that will turn into investment, that will turn into growth. But that demographic dividend is available only if you're able to find jobs, right? Now you're talking about disparity between South and North Indian states. There is a disparity. Kerala reached the replacement level a decade ago. Tamil Nadu reached maybe 5 years ago. Other southern states have reached now. North Indian states, except Bihar, I think, I could be corrected, but most states in India have come below TFR. Some states significantly below TFR. So demographics are going to change across states, but I'm hoping that internal migration will solve this problem. In fact, how many of you go to Bangalore or Hyderabad, go to Bangalore, go to any random restaurant, middle up, high-class restaurant, the waiting staff is bound to be from the Northeast. That's migration is taking place. Ravi, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you for a very evocative start to your presentation this afternoon. When you spoke about the girl child in school, the toilets being built for them, that's making such a big difference, and the midday meal schemes. One of the things that bothers me about India when I look at it is the falling level of protein intake. Amidst this visible prosperity that you see on the surface, could you please explain to me why our protein intake is coming down, and what are the implications of this?
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Dhruvo. I'm a consultant in shipping, ports, industrial estates, and decarbonization. You talked about unemployment and inequality, two key issues facing the country right now. And then the debate with regards to manufacturing and/or services. The question is twofold. Does it have to be either manufacturing or services, or can it be both together? Number one. Number two, you talked about low-tech, focus on low-tech so that job creation is more. And then you talked about MSME. I have two questions with regards to that. If it is low-tech, means you need to really be competitive because you're competing against China's imports. And there, because of mass production, they have cost advantage. So how do you expect Indian MSMEs to be cost competitive unless there are some specific measures, whether it is tariff or other subsidies or other kind of incentive schemes? And so question is, what do you think those measures could be? Number one. Number two, if it is not just MSMEs, but also bigger investments to come from organized sectors, big corporates. And for that to happen, do you reckon a significant policy change with regards to the labor reform? Do you think that will be a key? And what kind of political will is required to do that? Basically, those are my questions. Thank you.
Just to be fair on this side, shall I take this question or come back to you? For sure, in the next round. Please.
Thank you. My name is Chris Pico. I'm a former civil servant in America, but now a startup founder visiting Singapore. I found your remarks about high tech and the low dividend it yielded for the wider Indian economy interesting. And I was hoping you could expand a bit more on kind of a summary assessment of how much benefit this turn towards high tech has had in the economy. Possible topics, whether the diaspora, the success of Indian nationals in the United States and kind of the high tech economy, the computerization and the kind of conversion to digital identity and currency, and then artificial intelligence. The reason I came to Singapore is to kind of see such the effect of such a pro-government AI-led investment policy, and just whether you see, given your kind of assessment that the dividend may not have been big, whether that may not pan out for India as well.
Yeah. Okay. Ravi, a question about protein intake. That's actually, I'm surprised by that you found that protein intake is going down. Let me give some context to that. As an economic journalist, when I was governor, we had high and stubborn inflation. And Prime Minister Manmohan Singh used to ask me, what's the reason for this? I used to tell him that it is partly a problem of success. That inflation we were having at that time is partly a problem of success because people's incomes have gone up. When people's incomes go up, they shift from cereal to protein. People are consuming less of cereal, more of protein by way of milk, fish, eggs, meat, etc. It is a problem of success. And the reason we're having inflation is protein inflation. We're not able to, the supply is unable to catch up with the demand for protein. That's why we're having inflation. That is true. In fact, Subir Gokan, who's no more, coined this phrase that India is having protein inflation. That was a problem of success. Today, I'm surprised that protein intake is going down, but if it is actually going down, it must be a sign of distress because its incomes are going in the reverse direction. People are not able to afford protein and therefore they're consuming more cereals. Okay. One other question that comes up is, if demand for protein is going up, why is supply not going up? Supply did not go up because of cold chains, because of infrastructure was not there. And I leave it there because I'm not very comfortable extending my reply beyond that, but something that must be investigated. Dhruva's question about manufacturing or services, I don't see this as an either or choice. In fact, nobody should see. For a country, as it could be a choice, maybe for Singapore, or maybe for Taiwan, but not for a large, diverse economy like India, 4 trillion going on to 5 trillion, 1.4 billion people. We should be focusing on the entire chain of manufacturing and on the entire chain of services and on domestic market as well as the foreign market. So I don't see that as an either or question. What is distressing, perhaps you alluded to that, is that we are losing competitiveness even in low-end manufacturers. High-end manufacturers, we have to gain competitiveness, but we're losing competitiveness in textiles, in shoes, in toys, lots of household material, etc. That's what we should be investigating. And that's where all this MSME sector, enterprises at the low end of the chain come in. Again, my distress about the campaign is that nobody has come out with opened a debate on what should be done for the MSME sector. Some of the problems for the MSME sector are high cost. Infrastructure is bad, but infrastructure is improving. The physical infrastructure is improving. The software is improving. Digital technologies are improving even that. Credit is not available to them. Hopefully, digital technologies will make it possible to appraise the creditworthiness of individuals and enterprises who have not had a formal footprint in the financial sector. You understand what I'm getting at? Which is that even if somebody is not borrowed, does not have a credit history, merely because I have a phone and I do payments on the phone, will create my credit history and I can be assessed for my creditworthiness. So it is very important to look at the problems of the MSME sector. They don't get payments on time because they are at the low end of the chain. So ensuring that they're protected or at least safeguarded from evils on either side, both in terms of finance, in terms of production, is very important. What should be done, the nitty-gritty of that, I've been out of the government for 15 years. I can't flesh it out any further. Labor reforms, political will, it certainly requires political will. Prime Minister Modi attempted land reforms, left them. Attempted labor reforms, left them. Attempted farm sector reforms, left them to the states. And states are not following up. This is one of the center state federalism issues that is coming up. So one of the things that the Prime Minister, I think, should do, if Modi comes back, he should be fighting for a place in history. But if we have another Prime Minister, no matter who it is actually to call a meeting of chief ministers and say, now the election is behind us. This is a common task for the country. And what is it that we should be pushing for the economy? That's what they should be doing. I didn't get your name, the American civil servant. Chris Peter? Pico. Okay. High tech, you talked about. Do you follow the Davos dialogue? Davos, World Economic Forum. They talk about the fourth industrial revolution. Okay? That is based on high tech. No country today can afford to leave out higher education and high tech, because that's what's going to be your entry into the future. In Singapore, when I used to live here on a more continuous basis, I used to say in seminars that this globalization is a phenomenal advantage for Singapore. Because earlier, like you come here to start an enterprise, earlier Singapore was restricted by the size of its market, by the size of its geographical area. But today the world is a market. You could be in 29 Hang-Me-King Terrace and be selling to the world, right? All you need is a laptop. So innovation is very, very important. But innovation not by itself, you need the entire chain of primary education, middle education, higher education. The digital revolution is certainly adding value to it. But, I've tried to get hold of a study that actually puts some numbers on this. Everybody talks about how digital revolution is changing India, is magical, adding to GDP, adding to jobs, adding to productivity. Nobody has done a study. People throw out numbers as adding 1.5 percentage points to GDP. So I would like somebody to do a study of what is it actually doing. In fact, the government should do it so that they put out some numbers so that everybody else can contest that number. But that's a very important study we must be doing.
Thank you, Dr. Subbarao. We are almost running out of time, but I have promised we will take 3 questions. First, let's go there and then behind over there. Divya, we might have to maybe do it bilateral later.
No, but you can give preference to young girls.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, true. Please.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, my question is regarding your views on the transition of the Reserve Bank of India from the times of your favorite quote when you said that you hope that Mr. Chidambaram says that he's frustrated with the RBI, and yet he says, thank God that the RBI exists. From those times to the times now, when the RBI's relationship with Government of India, how that has transitioned from the special reserve outflow and the high dividends that the RBI is paying. What are the risks that you see going forward for this kind of association for a country like India, sir?
What's your name?
Kapil Jha. I'm Treasury Officer at Bank of Baroda, Singapore.
In Singapore?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Hello.
Sorry.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm Swati. I'm a research intern here at ISAS. One of the biggest transitions that I guess the world as such is going through is the climate crisis. I was wondering, going forward, how would you envision India's transition to like net zero and all the climate targets while also maintaining a steady economic growth and also tackling all the stacked up inequalities that they have, especially considering that you mentioned that we're losing competition in terms of the textile industry, which or the shoe manufacturing industry, all of which in its current state is not the most climate friendly. So how do you envision policies being balanced out to also maintain employment rate, but also meet climate targets with the entire world?
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your talk. I think this has been quite an interesting discussion post that as well. My question is regarding labor, and I think you in quite detail discuss the need for transition of labor or mobility of labor particularly. I think an increasing trend that there are 2 questions. First, in what sector are you, if you had to discuss in detail about labor mobility, what sector would you be looking at? Because at the moment, there is immense amount of labor mobility happening from the northern states to certain southern states, but it's limited to certain sectors. And the key problem that ends up happening is that the remittances do not go back, as a result of which those states remain to incur low growth. And I think an example that I would give would be for a state like Chhattisgarh, where the government had given initiatives which focused on skill training, as a result of which the citizens moved out, and eventually many of them were placed in Hyderabad, Bangalore, all these hubs that we talk about. And over a span of like a decade or 2, they eventually moved their families as well, as a result of which the state's growth level remains low despite, the state government making several initiatives. So then it becomes a vicious circle. In that case, when we talk about labor mobility, I think we also need to, I would be interested in knowing what your perspective is on in terms of sustaining growth in home states and then incurring growth there. Because if we see international investments in India, they also end up happening in states which have high economic growth. So you would say Maharashtra, Gujarat. So I might be wrong there, but I would really like you to touch upon these 2 questions. Thank you.
You want me?
It's up to you.
Okay, Divya, if you have a quick one.
Thank you, Dr. Pushpa, for allowing me. Thank you, Dr. Rao. My name is
I
Divya.
cannot see.
I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah.
My name is Divya. I'm a research associate at ISAS. Thank you for your talk. I just have one question. You briefly in your presentation mentioned about data and the quality of data. So since 2018, the government of India has stopped putting out the unemployment figures. We've been relying on the Center of CMIE for the unemployment data. Academicians have formally registered their concerns on this. What is your take on that? Because that could have serious policy implications. Without good data, you can't really make good policies. I would just like to hear your thought on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Kapil just question about RBI transition. Certainly, RBI has moved along. Since my time, it's about more than 10 years since I left the RBI. Even, it's been a continuous transformation of the RBI, starting with the 1990s, when it was almost a department of the Ministry of Finance, to becoming an independent, autonomous monetary policy institution as well as regulator. Today has been a continuous transition. And I can't define, milestones on this. If I do a detailed study, I can. But today, RBI is at par with most central banks around the world. The perception that RBI is less independent than advanced economy central bank, which is taken as a model, is more a perception. Just to give you an example, you referred to what Chidambaram, Finance Minister Chidambaram said when I was governor. What did Trump say? President Trump said the Federal Reserve has gone crazy. They're boneheads. China is not our number one enemy. Our number one enemy is the Federal Reserve. This is what Trump said. Even more sober presidents have complained against the Federal Reserve. Okay, so these tensions between governments and central banks are somewhat hardwired into the system. I think people read too much into the lack of autonomy of the central bank. I think it is getting better, but I don't think there are sharp differences between the best model and India's Reserve Bank of India. Swati, your question, very simple answer, I don't know. Okay, the point is that I'm not a climate change expert, but climate change, of course, is a big deal. There's tensions in managing that. There are costs of complying with climate standards, but that how do you manage those costs and manage the costs and benefits is a big challenge, especially in globalization. In fact, if I did not focus on the next 3 to 5 years, but focused on longer term, I would have talked about India's longer term challenges. Included in that will be climate change, globalization, artificial intelligence, demographic transitions, geopolitical tension. Those are all headwinds that we will face. But I cannot, and I don't want to, get deeper into that. On labor mobility, that's an interesting question about whether labor mobility leads to convergence or divergence. Historically, it is shown that labor mobility leads to convergence, even if the family, the first labor has moved, he brings the family or she brings the family, it helps. Labor mobility has improved in India. I'll give you an example. Those who are familiar with India, when I was governor, I used to go to Kerala in the southwest of the country. They speak Malayalam there. You go to the street corner early in the morning, you hear Bengali and Manipuri and Assamese being spoken. In India, 15 years ago, when I was governor, we used to hold classes, instruction in financial literacy in Kerala, in Bengali, in Assamese, and in Manipuri. Okay, so that's how much integration is taking place, not sufficient, but it should move on. You're worried that Chhattisgarh might get left behind because labor has moved with his family. I don't think that's much of a worry, because hopefully, if it is one country with no economic boundaries, we should converge over time. If it doesn't happen, the government should have explicit policies. State government should improve, right? One of the things about federalism is competition among states. I used to tell our chief minister when I was in Andhra Pradesh that the biggest thing that can happen is not General Motors coming to India, not coming to Andhra Pradesh. the biggest thing that can happen to us, General Motors is going to Tamil Nadu, and we, do a coup and get it to us. That's more dramatic than getting General Motors to Andhra Pradesh. Okay, so the states must compete, right? I'll leave it there.
And one more from Divya.
From
Divya, the last question.
yeah, Divya, about excuse me, I wrote it down here.
It's about data.
Yeah, data, very important thing. One of the basics of a market economy is data. And the government is obligated to put out data at regular intervals as best as it can. If there's an impression going around that the government is doctoring data, not disclosing data because it is inconvenient, it is a great disservice, and it is also against the interest of the economy, because people expect the worst. If you don't put out the unemployment number, people are not going to believe that the employment situation is hunky-dory. In fact, they're going to believe that the employment situation is actually worse than it actually is. So this weaponization of data is a very regressive thing that's happening. It's not good for a market economy. It's not good for an economy that wants to inspire the confidence of both domestic and global investors. It's a very good point.
Thank you, Dr. Subbarao. Perhaps the new government that will come in after June 4th, whichever it is, will perhaps come up with the new set of data, because elections will be over and everything will be then on track. But thank you so much, and we're sorry for those who couldn't put up the questions. We have overshoot our time by 10 minutes or so. Devian, do you have anything? Or shall we just end? Okay. So
He wants to give a vote of thanks, I think.
I can do that.
No, whatever.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the audience for coming, for the engaging questions. I think we had a very fruitful discussion. We look forward to seeing you in our first event.